good evening from London, and good afternoon or morning somewhere else, wherever you're from. My name is Mohammed Ahmedullah. I'm the Secretary of Brick Lane Circle. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes or a few minutes talking about Brick Lane Circle and give you some information about how the Bengal History Week started as more people come. So I will be also focusing on letting people in. Now, Brick Lane Circle, we started back in the 1990s, from cafe discussion in and around Brick Lane. Those days, no internet and very little information about Bangladesh. And many of us knew very little about our history. On Sunday afternoon, we used to get newspapers from Bangladesh, Friday issues, some weekly, some daily. They used to arrive in London. So our group, a lot of people used to go and buy just to keep themselves informed of developments in Bangladesh. And then we would go in cafes and, read and discuss and debate. But we didn't have, good background knowledge and understanding to contextualize, understand a more deeper way what was happening. People also spoke about politics in this country, especially local politics. All the cafes, were full with different groups of people talking politics all day and other things, having samosas and tea. So we decided, each one of us, to volunteer for a month, research, and then come back and make presentation in order to develop our knowledge and understanding. So we did that for several years, and then we stopped that. We then formally set up Brick Lane Circle. And when we formally set up Brick Lane Circle, I'm just going to share a screen very quickly. Be more easier to go through. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, in 2006, we decided to set up a formal organization, and from 2007, January to March, we organized a series of seminars. We had very good response and attracted, scholars and researchers and academics, and people from the community. We wanted ordinary people in the community to connect, with people doing research and thinking, analyzing and interpreting and explaining. 2007 was also the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Plassey, when the British took over Bengal, in 1757, June 23rd. So we thought that would be a good opportunity to use this anniversary to try and develop interest in history. So we organized a conference on Battle of Plassey, attracted, quite a lot of people. And you can see the flyer of the conference on the bottom right. When the conference finished, we developed a project for young people. And we attracted a lot of interest, but 8 young people completed the project. And they wrote a book on East India Company assets in London. And when that project finished, when the book was launched, we developed an exhibition based on the findings of the young people. And then, we organized a exhibition, interacted with a lot of people. And one of the young participants, a young Bangladeshi female, she said, we learned so much from this project. Why don't we continue the learning process by setting up a Bengal History Week? So that's how Bengal History Week was born in 2010. And we have been, running this every year, attracting many, people, students, academics, authors, and all kinds of people. If you look at our website, you can see details of what we have done. And there are nearly 100 videos online as well from different programs that we delivered over the years. About Brick Lane Circle, now, from the very beginning, because, I come from Bangladeshi community, and we are a very polarized society and very politicized, So it was very difficult to discuss and try and develop a kind of objective knowledge. So we promoted critical thinking and honesty, from the very beginning. and respect for evidence and objectivity. We try to encourage people to be non-political, and non-communal when it comes to knowledge seeking and knowledge sharing. And we also try to promote fearlessness, when you seek the truth, right? Because you must let your mind and evidence take you where you must go. And then, we try to encourage ordinary people from our communities to try and move, catch up with others to engage at the cutting edge level. So this is what Brickland Circle is what we've been aiming to achieve. I'm finished now. I will pass on to, I'm just going to see, our chair, someone who's going to chair, she's not here yet. If she doesn't arrive, what I will do, I will ask Shapan Adnan to say something about himself, and then he will to make his own presentation. Hopefully the chair will join. Otherwise, I will kind of run the Q&A session at the end. Thank you.
Ahmedullah, I suggest you read out from my
what you sent me, yeah? Hold on.
Yeah.
Let me just open it. Just so 1 second. Right, okay. Shapan Adnan is a professorial research associate with the Department of Development Studies of SOAS, University of London. He has formerly taught at the National University of Singapore and the Universities of Dhaka and Chittagong. He was a visiting scholar and visiting research fellow at the University of Oxford. Shapan Adnan holds a PhD in social and political science from the University of Cambridge and a BA Honours in economics from the University of Sussex. His teaching, research, and publications are mostly in the fields of political economy, sociology, and development. His area of special interest is the South Asian region, including Myanmar, with a focus on Bangladesh. Normally, we say people should speak for between 30 and 40 or 50 minutes, and then we take Q&A questions, and people can ask questions through chat or verbally directly. Shapan bhai, you can start now.
Let me share screen first.
Which screen is it sharing?
I'm not sure. If it is here, can you see the screen now?
Yes, it's very clear.
Okay, sorry about that initial delay. Let me start. The title of the talk is Disappearing Villages, Social and Economic Change in Rural Bangladesh. The period I cover is 1942 to 2020. Now, before I move on, let me first thank Ahmedullah and the Brickland Circle for inviting me to give this talk. It's over 10 years that I've been involved with the Brickland Circle, giving talks, so it's a pleasure to be back here again. Now, I should say that today I will speak on an issue which is huge, and I obviously I will not be able to cover everything about rural Bangladesh and changes there. Also, I should say that it will be difficult not to exaggerate certain things because tremendous changes have taken place. Now, I will try and say all of this in a manner which is comprehensible to the general audience. In other words, I'm not speaking in specialist language. I will speak in general terms. So without further ado, let me go on into the talk. The first thing is that this talk is focused on what is Eastern Bengal. For those of you who are familiar with South Asia and Bengal, this may be superfluous, but for those of you who are not, Bengal is or was a united province under British rule, but it was divided at the time of the departure of the British Raj, and West Bengal joined India with Calcutta as the major city. East Bengal is what became East Pakistan, and then Bangladesh with the capital in Dhaka. Now, the area that I'm going to cover is, on the one hand, the floodplain heartlands of the country, but I will also contrast what happens in the mainland, in the sort of heartlands, with boundary regions. And there are many boundary regions like the Chittagong Hill Tracts, the deltaic coastlands, other agroecological zones. I will focus on the Chittagong Hill Tracts. The period that I cover will be about 7 decades, from the 1940s up to 2020, when I did my last fieldwork. Ramkrishna Mukherjee's study of 6 Bogra villages over 1942-45 is the starting point. It provides the picture against which the benchmark against which we see what kind of change has been taking place. The milestones at this starting point are the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, and of course the partition of Bengal in 1947 with the departure of the British colonial state. The focus of the analysis will be on village settlements, which are microcosms of rural society. What I will try to provide is an overview of changes in social, economic, and cultural relations, disappearance of institutions and practices of village life, in that sense, irreversible changes, as well as advent of new institutions and practices in rural society and economy. Now, we move immediately into the impact of the partition of 1947. This led to the emergence, as I've said, of the new states of India and Pakistan, present-day India and present-day Pakistan, which then was, of course, divided into West Pakistan, which is now Pakistan, and East Pakistan became Bangladesh. This was a period of violent Hindu-Muslim communal conflicts, and massive flows of refugees went in both directions. In 1950, there was the East Bengal State Acquisition Act of 1950. This land reform effectively abolished the zamindari system set up under the permanent settlement, and this meant that landlords and intermediaries with their rights to land had those rights abolished. This led to a massive outmigration of Hindu refugees from East Bengal, mostly upper caste Hindus, because this was the group which was the major landholding group, holding zamindari and intermediary positions. There were, of course, Muslims who were also in the same position, but the majority were Hindus and typically of the upper castes. At the same time, there was in-migration of Muslim refugees from West Bengal and other provinces of India. Now, what this period saw was the transfer of land rights of Hindus to Muslims by markets, either market sale or by exchange of property or by outright force, where Hindu property was grabbed by local Muslims. This was the context of the initial upheaval. By 1971, when the Pakistan military cracks down on the population of East Pakistan, there is another massive outflow of refugees, both Muslims and Hindus, some of whom return later, and with the liberation of Bangladesh at the end of 1971. So through these, and I'm kind of telescoping many events into and compressing them, to give you a kind of satellite view of change, what we see are drastic shifts in rural society, the demographic composition, and agrarian structure. These I will elaborate on. Following the initial partition and the initial population movements, we have the advent of agricultural development, preeminently the Green Revolution. Now, this involved new seed fertilizer irrigation technology and crop production. It led to changes in cropping patterns and increases in agricultural productivity through changes in the crop mix and the cropping intensity. But it also led to class conflicts over the incremental gains from new technology. Because land productivity or yields went up, landlords wanted to retain more of the product than the tenants could keep them, particularly through sharecropping, where the output was divided equally or usually equally between the landlord and the sharecroppers. So there were attempts to increase the share of the landlord or convert the rent to fixed rent in cash. So these led to changes in production relations. And the outcome, again, in a summary form, was discontinuation of sharecropping, one of the aspects of disappearing villages that I am going to try and highlight. Instead, you have the growth of fixed tenancy in cash, usually in advance, or in some cases, eviction of tenants and resumption of land by landowners. At the same time, there is the emergence of reverse tenancy and reverse mortgage, where those who normally were landowners rather than tenants become tenants. And this really refers to large, sort of what one would call rich peasants or capitalist tenants who are sometimes renting land even from small landowners. There is also labor shortage and increase in real wages. At the same time, the increase in real wages leads to shrinking profitability in production of rice and cereals generally. So people look for alternatives and alternatives which are more profitable. And this is where commercial farming and new supply chains supporting them come into operation. And there is massive expansion in poultry, fish farming, shrimp culture on a commercial basis. To sum up, we have interrelated changes in the agrarian structure following the advent of the Green Revolution. You have land grabs where people are evicted from their land. Sharecroppers, as I said, are kind of elbowed out. There is massive landlessness and marginalization as groups which could survive as tenants and sharecroppers before have to find a new way of existing. And in those cases where people cannot find a way of surviving, there is outmigration. In technical terms, what we see in this period is elements of primitive accumulation and capitalist transformation of peasant agriculture. And by primitive accumulation, very simply, I mean the kind of accumulation which is necessary for capitalist production to take place. Capitalists need both the means of production, in this case land, and they need labor which is willing to work. And what separation of people, peasants and sharecroppers from their lands does is to make the labor available for employment as wage workers, whereas their erstwhile lands become available to those who are willing to, who are capable of taking those over and using them for production. So I now move on, as I said, to the regional, a particular region of Bangladesh to show the contrast between the floodplain heartlands and the regional boundaries. And I will consider now the Chittagong Hill Tracts as a contrast, the mainstream story. The map shows you the location of Bangladesh, but also apart from you can see this is the Chittagong Hill Tracts, this slightly shaded area here. It's on the border with India, the states of Tripura, Mizoram, Meghalaya, or not Meghalaya for the Chittagong Hill Tracts. And on the southeastern side, you have the Chin state and Arakan state of Myanmar. So this is the region I'm going to talk about. The specific features of the Chittagong Hill Tracts is that it's historically inhabited by 12 distinct ethnic groups who are known as Paharis or hill peoples. They're mostly Buddhists with smaller groups of Christians, Hindu and nature worshippers. The traditional livelihood avenues of the hill peoples used to be, or still is, jhum cultivation, which is sweeten or slash and burn farming, which is suited to hill slopes. But from the beginning of the 20th century, under British patronage, there was also the advent of wet rice cultivation with the plow in the river valleys of the CHT. In addition, for the hill peoples in general, hunting and gathering in forests and wetlands, sort of common land resources, were very important for their survival. Now, in this context, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, there is the construction of the Kaptai Hydroelectricity Project, which submerged settlements and wet rice lands. Nearly 40% of the best rice lands are submerged. What this results in is a loss of homesteads and livelihoods of the hill peoples, displacement and outmigration of the hill peoples. Some become international refugees by crossing the border into India and Myanmar. Others become internally displaced persons, mostly living in the reserve forest of the Chittagong Hill Tracts, deep in the rural interior. So what again we see in the Chittagong Hill Tracts is critical disruption and restructuring of the economy, society, and politics, but in a very different way from that of mainstream Bangladesh as a whole. These are some pictures to give you a feel for the Chittagong Hill Tracts. The houses are built on stilts. It's a large, predominantly Buddhist area compared to the Muslim majority of Bangladesh. And this is the impact of the Kaptai Hydroelectricity Project. The island that you see is actually hilltop, like the hills in the background. It has become submerged. This shows a part of Rangamati town, which is above the water, but most of the water that you see on the left and in the front is also Rangamati town, which lies under water. Now, in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, following the Kaptai project, there is a period of discrimination and neglect of the CHT by the central government, and also towards the end of the war of 1971, there are land grabs of the hill peoples and attacks on their communities. This leads to demands for recognition and protection by the hill peoples, which is rejected by the government of Bangladesh after liberation. And this eventually leads to armed rebellion by hill peoples in the late 1970s, followed by counterinsurgency warfare. As a result, what we see a pattern of interrelated changes, all of them disruptive. Hill peoples are forcibly evicted from their villages and regrouped under military surveillance in sort of villages under control. Displaced hill peoples become international refugees again, or internally displaced persons in the reserve forests. State organized transmigration of 300,000 to 400,000 Bengali Muslim settlers to the CHT takes place as part of the counterinsurgency strategy involving demographic engineering as to have a more loyal population as vis-a-vis rebel hill peoples. The lands of the hill peoples are forcefully redistributed to Bengali settlers and also plantation owners who don't come to the hill tracts, but who live in cities like Chittagong and Dhaka, but are absentee owners of these huge lands which belong to the hill peoples. Now, in some cases, former Pahari or hill people's villages are transformed into Bengali settler settlements. So in terms of the landscape, what you see is a massive, massive upheaval in terms of uprooting of the hill peoples, in migration of Bengali settlers, redistribution of land of the Pahari people to the Bengali settlers. So a completely new landscape and a new regime of property rights takes over. And this leads to 2 decades of uh, insurgency and counterinsurgency warfare, which is brought to an end in December 1977. But despite this peace accord, the lost lands and village settlements of the hill peoples are not restituted to them as had been promised in the peace treaty. In addition, there are new development projects with counterproductive consequences. For example, there are afforestation projects for rubber plantations, which also, apart from taking over the common lands of the hill peoples, in some cases create new artificial villages to settle evicted hill peoples. There is growth of commercial enterprises, including tourism run by elite groups and powerful civilian and military agencies. There is violence on Pahari ethnic groups to grab their lands, forests, common resources. This does not stop after the peace accord. On the contrary, it increases, partly because there is now no resistance from the hill peoples because their armed forces have surrendered. So there is this drastic transformation of ethno-demographic composition, land rights, and village settlements of the CHT. Here again, as in the floodplains of Bangladesh, we see dispossession, primitive accumulation, uneven capitalist transformation, despite other differences with the mainstream areas of the country. This is just a few shots to give you an idea of the kind of things that I've just talked about. This is a military camp in the hill tracks during the insurgency. These camps still continue in most cases. This is patrolling by the security forces in the hill tracks. These are pictures of Bengali settlers who were brought into the hill tracks. They're mostly landless peasants who had little idea of what they were getting into. They were brought in by the government under civilian and military arrangements and organization. So you have this massive inflow of poor people from another part of the country who were settled or who were made settlers in the Chittagong hill tracts. And here you have a picture of the hill peoples who had been refugees in India and have just returned to Bangladesh after the peace accord. They are unable to find their own homes, which may have been taken over. And this is a primary school, and the people are simply they're asked to live in these classrooms of the primary schools. You can see the veranda of the primary schools and even a weaving loom which has been set up, a very traditional kind of practice of the hill peoples. So that gives us an overview of the kind of landscape of both of the central floodplains of Bangladesh and its hilly and forested boundary region in the southeast. Now I move on to broad processes of change covering both the mainstream of Bangladesh and the Chittagong hill tracts. I begin with industrialization. Now, to begin with, after partition, there is a period of decline in traditional cottage industries due to competition from modern industrial products. In parallel, there is establishment of factories in the proximity of villages and rural bazaars. There are export processing zones and special industrial zones which are set up. And these generate off-farm employment for rural men and women for nearby village settlements. So in a way, they provide employment outside agriculture, including crop cultivation, fisheries, poultry and livestock through industrial employment. And interestingly, there is also a growth of usually corresponding transportation systems for the movement of rural workers, both male and female, to the places of work and back. There are also women who stay in their homes in the village, but able to produce industrial goods through putting out systems set up by either NGOs or commercial farms producing craft goods. In the CHT, we see the hill peoples, usually the young men and women, moving out from the hill tracts to work in industrial units like garments factories in Chittagong city and other urban areas. And another impact of industrialization is the availability of industrial products and consumption goods in remote rural bazaars, including the deep rural interior. I will discuss that later. Similarly, there is the process of urbanization and its impacts. And this takes place in several ways. There is, first of all, the growth of existing cities and towns which encroach into adjoining villages. But apart from that, in the rural interior itself, new urban sites or nodes emerge. These are bazaars, marketplaces, municipalities, upazila or sub-district headquarters. These places receive connections for electricity, water supply, and other utilities. So what this creates is a vast set of industrial urban nodes in the midst of the countryside. This also leads to rural urban migration, and which is propelled by, first of all, the usual push and pull factors. Push meaning where people are pushed out because they've lost land. Pull factors in terms of attractions, of the possibility of getting jobs, salaried jobs in the city. Social networks which help migrants to go from rural villages to unknown impersonal cities. Patterns of chain migration and community formation, whereby, say, people from Noakhali have a basti or a slum in Dhaka city, and newcomers are able to come and find shelter there. So villagers who go to the city through occasional visits or as migrant workers obviously experience urban living conditions, but even those who don't go to the towns, who are still staying in the village, there is still exposure to urban lifestyles through programs and advertisements on mobile phones, TV, cinema, the news media, and also the social media. As you know, given the popularity of Facebook and other social media through mobile phones. Young men and women in the villages prefer to leave the village and rural livelihoods for modern urban lifestyles, the anonymity the city offers, and the relative freedom from conservative social restrictions, particularly for young women. In general, the young people, the younger generations, do not want to stay in the village and follow the professions of their forefathers, like farming and fishing. They are eager to branch out into other things. Now, in this context, let me also highlight the dimension of women's position and gender relations in the context of all of these changes. Traditionally in Bangladesh, rural women's mobility had been restricted to indoor arenas, meaning they had to stay inside the house in the domestic sphere, partly because of the traditional parda system or veiling system, and partly because of the general constraint imposed by the system of patriarchy. However, from the 1970s, women began breaking out of confinement in domestic work, increased participation in public places, for example, agriculture, industry, shops, and markets. Now, this was the combined outcomes of changes in the agrarian structure that I've outlined earlier, declining familial landholding. So as a household finds that it is losing land, it doesn't have sufficient land to produce its own subsistence crop, it must find earnings outside. And it may be that the men folk cannot earn enough. Those are the conditions where the women have to go out and find work. There is no choice. And this is the kind of economic demographic imperative with the redistribution of land and the growth of landlessness. But in addition, I've talked about the impacts of industrialization and urbanization. So apart from just the pressure of livelihoods within the old agrarian structure. You have the possibilities offered by industrialization and new cities and the growth of rural outmigration. In the case of the hill tract, the hill women or the Pahari women, they were less restricted by patriarchy and parda and social norms to that effect compared to their Bengali counterparts. Uh, mm, one could find, and one still does find, women, hill women running shops and eating places in village markets, and their younger generations have now also begun to work in garments and industrial factories in Chittagong and other cities. And what you also see is a pattern of disciplining of wage labor in industry and agriculture, the kind of disciplining that impacts on wage working women. Uh, Women in some cases become primary breadwinners, and there is growth of female-headed households where the women have male dependents. Another factor which has been important to rural Bangladesh is the growth of microcredit programs. This has had a double-edged or ambivalent effect or contradictory effect. On the one hand, it has led to growth in incomes and self-provisioning by women who have managed to set up petty businesses and make sufficient profit from that to survive. So these might be regarded as instances of empowerment. But there has also been the situations where the women have simply served as conduits for credit, which has been taken over by their husbands or male members of the family. They've simply become instruments who are used by the microcredit system to actually link up with the actual producers who happen to be men. In addition, the discipline of the remorseless discipline, and I say of weekly repayments, which has then been followed by debt default and litigation and confiscation of the property or the utensils of the borrowers, has led to tremendous discouragement in terms of participation by women in microcredit. In the Chittagong Hill Tracts, there has been flight by groups which did not or could not meet the discipline of weekly repayments. So it's been a mixed story with microcredit. On the positive side, growth in rural women's education and literacy, of the rates of growth have often exceeded those of their male counterparts. And these varied changes in terms of participation in work, participation in credit programs, in education and literacy, have also had cumulative socio-demographic impacts. So what one finds in Bangladesh is a decline in fertility rates, a drastic reduction in the TFR, or the total fertility rate. There is rise in age at first marriage, and there is increased spacing of children. So all of these have also affected women's lives. One should also note that women's increased participation in public spaces has happened despite increased threats of sexual harassment and assault. This has been a particularly extreme case in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, where hill women have been subjected to sexual violence and rape by Bengalis. What one might just say is that despite such pressure and despite such intimidation, women have continued to participate in public spaces, either because of voluntary intentions or in some cases because they have no other choice. Moving on, what we see as a result of the economic demographic changes that I've discussed earlier are the changes in the marketing structures, particularly the bazaars or marketplaces. And this has been made facilitated by the expansion of road, rail, and water transport linkages, which have stimulated growth of bazaars. Uh, and what one finds is that with the growth and changes in agriculture and industrial um, production in rural areas, one can now find in bazaars inputs for commercial agriculture, fisheries, poultry, shrimp farming, etc. Industrial products and consumer goods are now sold in outlets in village bazaars. Another kind of change has been there used to be traditionally temporary weekly bazaars, say in sites A, B, and C, but these temporary weekly bazaars have now become permanent bazaars with permanent shops which operate every day of the week. And as a result, the breakdown of linkages between bazaars A, B, and C, which operated on different days of the week, and people went to Bazaar X on Monday and Bazaar Y on Tuesday and Z on Wednesday. That kind of patterning of market interaction has come to an end to a large extent. Instead, what we see are changes in the structure of market-based rural microregions in terms of the sites, the times when the markets operate, and the products that they sell or transact in. Along with this, we see shifts in rural consumption patterns, even in the very remote bazaars of the country, including the CHT, you find domestic and foreign consumer goods in the deep interior of reserve forests or in bazaars close to the international borders with India and Myanmar. This has been partly made possible by rise in incomes and purchasing power of wage workers and lower middle classes. In rural Padna, for example, I found that wage workers and petty shop owners and even small petty white collar professionals were able to buy TV and fridges from the shops, usually on installments. And this kind of change in consumption pattern has been made possible not just by the rise in incomes and purchasing power of local producers, but also because of the inflow of remittances from migrant workers who send money to their families in rural areas. There has also been change in taste and consumer demand through use of mobile phones, television, internet. Urban lifestyles and consumerism has been projected by movies, TV shows, entertainment program, and advertisements. Influence, and of course, migrants who have returned to the village or have come to visit the village, their families, have also brought with them consumer goods and different consumer tastes and demands. There is also the growing presence of urban middle classes in rural locations in the various nodes of nascent urbanization, like the Upazila headquarters and upgraded municipal areas. For example, government officials, NGO workers, school teachers, doctors who are staying in a basically rural setting and who thereby set standards of taste and consumption, which aspiring groups, social groups in rural areas try to emulate by following their practices. So, for example, you see in rural districts of North Bengal, growing use of caterers and decorators, sound systems for marriages and other ceremonies, liquefied gas cookers for cooking, and so on. Moving on now to rural social organization. What we see, what has been the traditional pattern in rural Bangladesh has been, on the one hand, a breakdown of joint families into smaller nuclear families over time. And this has, in some cases, led to even further breakdowns where nuclear families have split up and there are subnuclear units, and in some cases, female-headed households that I've already referred to. Now, these patterns are linked to reduction in landholding. Typically, those who have large landholdings are able to have large joint families as landholdings held in common decline, and there is nothing to bind in terms of property, common property. Households split up from the large joint families. This kind of change can be accentuated by periods of acute crisis. For example, during the Great Bengal Famine of 1942-43, Ramakrishna Mukherjee's work shows that there was breakdown of families, but mostly amongst the poor who did not have land or did not have adequate landed property to keep them together. In contrast, there were mergers of families amongst the richer landed groups. Similar patterns were observed during the famine of 1974 and its aftermath in village studies in Dhaka and other parts of Bangladesh. Now, apart from the families, the other of individual households, we have Bangladesh, rural Bangladesh has been characterized by a kind of social grouping, a kind of association of households, which are variously known as Samaj, Ballot, Reai. Typically, these are comprised of households belonging to several patrilineages or kin groups with agnatic and affinal kin. They're led by the most influential members, who are known as Samaj leaders or Samaj Pradhans. This kind of Samaj organization is preeminently observed amongst the Muslim peasantry of Bangladesh, but also it has been found to operate among the caste stratified Hindu peasantry in East Bengal. I'm not certain about West Bengal, as I've not actually studied there, but I believe that in Bangladesh at least you can find Samaj, or you could find Samaj groups amongst Muslims and Hindus. I say could because, as I will discuss in a minute, Samaj organization has been breaking down. Now, before I get into that, what did Samaj organization attained? Households belonging to the same Samaj have rights and obligations to each other during life cycle rituals like birth, death, and marriage. And these are based on reciprocal and redistributive norms like exchanging gifts, or when you have large religious and traditional ceremonies involving redistribution on a social scale, like the Qurbani Eid or Eid al-Adha or the Durga Puja of the Hindus. The occasion is on such a scale and involves so many different functions that a division of labor is necessary, and that cannot be done. That kind of division or coordination cannot be done by a single household or a single family. A group is needed, and that is where the Samaj grouping comes into the picture. However, Samaj groups also are not permanent and immutable. They break up either because of growth in the number of households, making management of Samaj functions unwieldy, but also because issues pertaining to the izzat or honor of groups provides pretexts or excuses or flashpoints of social conflict. For example, issues about women's izzat or status. And these typically lead to strains in, if not breakups, among Samaj groups. On a long-term perspective, from studies that we have have been conducted by other scholars and also in my own work, we've seen the growth, merger, and partitioning of Samaj groups over time. And what this suggests is that if you fast forward the picture of change in rural Bangladesh, you see changes taking place in Samaj configuration, despite the deceptive appearance of stability, if you're not fast forwarding and looking at it at its normal pace. In addition to the Samaj, there is also There are also mechanisms of conflict resolution and legitimate authority. Amongst this, the shalish or bichar mechanism is used to resolve conflicts between households and groups, both within the same Samaj and between different Samaj groups or even different villages. Now, those who preside over the Shalish bench and give verdicts are known as Shalishkars. Usually, they are the leaders of the concerned Samaj groups, but sometimes people with acumen in judicial matters and with legal knowledge can be drafted in to become Shalishkars. The fairness in verdicts and the ability to enforce them enhance the social power and prestige of Shalishkars. So peasants in rural Bangladesh aspiring to become leaders try to gain the position of Shalishkars. And there is competition among Shalishkars to gain prestige and followers, and some win and some lose out in that kind of competition. The Shalish, or the kind of arbitrating mechanism, has been the traditional organ of expressing legitimate authority and power among the peasantry of rural Bangladesh. These functions and the institutions which mediated them have provided the basis of legitimate authority amongst the peasantry. But in recent decades, these institutions have been subject to erosion and weakness, partly because of failure of Samaj leaders and Shalishkars to uphold norms of fairness and morality. For example, if they are seen as giving judgments which are manifestly unfair, or if they're found to be corrupt, but also in addition to internal weaknesses of the Samaj and Shalish, the role of arbitration and conflict resolution has been taken over by other groups, other agencies like local self-government officials, so union council or Upazila council chairman or members, the local police, even leaders and activists of major political parties and party cadres have taken over conflict resolution functions in recent times. What this means is the center of gravity of legitimate power and authority has shifted from the Samaj and Shalish to other agencies outside the village and which operate according to very different norms, usually norms of discriminatory patronage. And what this means is for the traditional social order based on Samaj leaders and Shalishkars, there is a growing legitimacy crisis of traditional authority in rural Bangladesh. I now move on to changes in rural power structure, clientelist and class relations. The traditional power structure of rural Bangladesh had involved Samaj leaders and Shalishkars, followed by their fellow Samaj members, typically large landowners, joddars, who are often known as joddars, or rich peasants, who combine crop cultivation with rent extraction, as say from tenants and sharecroppers, trading, money lending, and also holding office in local self-government. This traditional power structure was mobilized for elections and other kinds of political conflicts through the formation of coalitions. These coalitions of interest groups mobilized support by either alliances between leaders of Samaj groups or cross-cutting Samaj groups along caste, class, or communal lines. There has also been increased linkages between local power structure and state agencies, like, for example, the district administration or the Upazila administration, and also with national political parties, as these national level parties have formed local units with their local party bosses. So the local level power structure has linked up with the intermediate and upper rungs of the countrywide power structure. And this entire structure is characterized by clientelist relations at all levels between patrons and followers. And these cut across social ties, status groups, and class structures clientelist relations are trans-class rather than mobilized on class lines. And typically the kind of politics they produce are that of discriminatory patronage and factional conflicts. However, these have been not entirely monolithic. Um, there have been class and communal conflicts between land grabbers and dispossessed groups. In the Chittagong Hill Tracts, where the rebellion took place primarily because of the grabbing of Pahari lands by Bengalis and the state, but also in the floodplain areas, in the riverine and coastal shore areas, there have been conflicts which have led to breakdown and reformation of clientelist and class relations. For example, in the shore areas of Noakhali, a group called the Bonodosu or forest bandits, who had been powerful and had mobilized landless groups by settling them, were eventually crushed by more powerful patrons and political leaders because they wanted to grab the lands which had been used to settle the landless population. Correlatively, there have been shifts in the power structure of the Chittagong Hill Tracts in its rural areas. Bengali settlers in moving into CHT have taken over positions in local government offices, so they have become, on an increasing scale, union council members and Upazila chairman. But apart from the Bengalis taking over the power structure in rural CHT, there have also been splits among the Pahari resistance and Pahari political groups. And so one sees a breakdown of solidarity among the hill people. So it's a combination of those forces. But it is not just these that we are talking about. In the rural Bangladesh now encompasses the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, who were settled not only in the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, but who have now branched out into the local villages in Cox's Bazar and also the Bandarban district of the Chittagong Hill Tracts. And among them, there used the traditional social and political structure involved leaders called Majis. Now, what has happened is Majis were selected by these Rohingya communities themselves, but in Bangladesh, local administrators appoint the Majis. And also the Rohingya militant groups like the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, ARSA, has tremendous power within the refugee camps and among the population. Now, these are migrants and refugees, but they have now increasingly become parts of rural society in Bangladesh, and one needs to take account of these additional and slightly exceptional patterns as well. But it is not only domination that we're talking about. There are also patterns of resistance and instances of covert resistance becoming transformed into open confrontation. Traditionally, the institutions of the Samaj and Shalish attempt to maintain traditional social order. And groups which are dominated, like the poor and the landless, practice a mix of outward compliance towards those who dominate them. And if they resist them, this takes covert forms like the weapons of the weak mentioned by James Scott. The power relations are trans-class, and to challenge them, one needs lateral mobilization of the poor and the weak. And such instances have happened in Bangladesh. I will just mention them. I do not have time to discuss the details, but the range of possibilities can be seen from the following example. The electoral mobilization of the poor peasantry by populists. There is an example from rural Pabna. There is popular mobilization against counterproduction development interventions, like the huge region-wide mobilization of the peasantry in Bil Dakatia, which was an area, a polder which had become waterlogged and which led to intervention in terms of public cuts and breaching of embankments by the people. But there has also been opposition to the flood action plan, a multi-billion-dollar project which was being imposed by the World Bank and donor agencies in Bangladesh. There has been violent conflict between poor peasants and land-grabbing forces, for example, in rural Noakhali and Borishal Chor areas, and in some cases, not all, that kind of resistance has enabled the poor to survive. And of course, the limiting case is the armed rebellion by the Hill peoples against state and counterinsurgency operations in the CHT. So resistance, and including open resistance, armed conflict, armed resistance, is to be seen in Bangladesh, as well as less overt forms, less violent forms. And this range of resistance practices tell us that the poor and the weak are not simply being dominated, but have exerted their abilities as far as possible to protect their rights. However, despite such instances, there is persistence of overall domination of rural power structure over the peasantry of Bangladesh. So to conclude, what are the perspectives on social and economic changes in rural Bangladesh? I've tried to give a kind of summary view of the historical landscape of changes. It began with a portrayal of a rural society scarred by violent conflicts during partition of 47, the Liberation War of 1971, and the counterinsurgency in the CHT from the 1970s, late 1970s to the late 1990s. And these have been marked by communal discrimination and ethnic and religious violence. And these have also been accompanied by transformation of land rights, redistribution of land, agrarian structure changes, and the drastic alteration of ethno-religious demographic composition. We've had economic development, but these have also led to counterproductive consequences. I've mentioned the Kaptai Hydroelectricity Project, but the Bil Dakatia project in the floodplains is also notable. There have been patterns of rural out-migration by people who have left the village to find ways of survival elsewhere and who sent remittances back home. These processes have been accompanied by land grabs, inequality in wealth, processes of primitive accumulation, and capitalist transformation. At the same time, there has been resistance by dispossessed and threatened groups. Factors which have been driving the metamorphosis of rural Bangladesh include agrarian change, industrialization, urbanization, migration, and globalization. And in some cases, we've seen irreversible changes and disappearing of aspects of rural society and economy. These historical changes have contemporary relevance because they provide these historical breaks and continuities provide lessons about what is happening today and what might happen in the future. Let me just end by saying that I have more detailed discussion of some of these themes in my forthcoming book in Bengali, titled Gram Bangla Rupantor, which is due to be published by University Press Limited, Dhaka. Thank you.
Thank you, Shapan Adnan bhai. It's very interesting and detailed presentation. Quite easy to follow as well. So thank you for that. We have some time now for questions. I'm just trying to figure out how to chair this event because our chair for some reason hasn't been able to join us today. So what I would say is that you can raise your hand, ask a question or comment, or even add information from your own research or experience and knowledge of developments in rural Bangladesh, the changes. You can also type in questions on chat, So can you have the first question, please, anybody? Peter, would you like to start? Yeah, Peter. You can mute first.
My experience of working in Bangladesh has mainly been in NGOs, some with rural background work. Would you say that the role of NGOs has been quite small in the changes that you've described, or quite major? I mean, it's a very simplistic question in a way. I mean, you could say in relation to the role of women, but that was my question, I thought, anyhow. Because it seemed like what you were describing was quite changes that were going on anyhow, and NGOs think they're doing a lot, but maybe they're not. But that's my sort of question, anyhow.
Yes. Amidullah, should I answer this or?
Yes, please, one at a time. We can follow you.
Yes, okay. This is a very interesting question. It's also a difficult question.
Yeah.
There is no doubt that NGOs have had a very significant role in certain aspects of change in rural Bangladesh. I've mentioned microcredit. And microcredit has been usually with women's groups. So in that sense, there has been impact on women's position and gender relations. Whether this has been entirely for the good is a questionable matter. I've pointed out the benefits and as well as the drawbacks of those programs. But NGO activities are not confined only to microcredit. There are groups like those which have practiced conscientization rather than lending to empower groups. And in some cases, these NGOs like Nijera Puri and others have formed landless groups amongst the poor peasantry, who have then mobilized themselves to oppose oppression and exploitation. For example, in the Noakhali Chor areas that I just mentioned very briefly, the major opposition has come from Bhumihin Shomitis or landless associations organized by Nijera Kuri, and they have tackled and in some cases literally fought armed attacks on their villages by land grabbers and their Mastan or Mastan Bahinis of their kind of strong armed men. And in some cases, they've succeeded in protecting their areas. So there is the example of that, which is undoubtedly very important. At the same time, one must also point out that NGOs have limitations in rural mobilization. They're subject to, they're accountable to the government and they're accountable to their donors. They cannot go in for activities which go beyond the limited repertoire of things that they're allowed. So for example, you do not get NGOs running in the Chittagong Hill Tracts in the rebellion against the state. That is done by political groups, often with their left-wing kind of predisposition. So in that sense, I would just summarize by saying NGOs have had significant impact within a limited domain. While one commends what they have done, one must also note the limits to which their activities are subject.
Sure, thank you.
What kind of NGOs have you been involved with, Peter?
Well, mostly church-based NGOs, but the last one I was involved in was called Mennonite Central Committee, and they were working in the north, where I was based in Mymensingh, but in the northern area. And I was just in your description, Shapan, of how people migrate to the city, the aim of the NGO was to develop the local economy or to develop work or opportunities for local people. And it's just, it's the sense that actually, at the end of the day, that the process of urbanization or rural drift is such that this hasn't happened. But that was the sort of the hope that local areas would become stronger and develop their own economies rather than just drift to the city, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, there is no question that, there has been some impact, but it's also been far short of what was expected or imagined. And I think to understand that, one needs to look at the theory of change, if I can put it that way. The kind of NGO theory of change often leaves out structural factors, political and political economy issues, which actually have a role in shaping the outcome of these efforts, but which are not factored into NGO programs. So in that sense, if you do an objective analysis from a more disinterested standpoint, you can see those limitations of NGO activities.
Next question from Terry, please.
Thank you very much. Shapan, very interesting, and I'm so pleased that you've included a very robust use of class analysis in this, because I find this almost completely lacking from most analysis of developing countries, including Bangladesh, where I've done bits of work for 10 years or so, mostly relating to adaptation to climate change. And my question relates to Peter's in some respects as well. A lot of the work that is done in relation to climate change or disaster risk reduction that I see through external agencies or NGOs is completely ignoring class relations. Now, I completely understand this, because an NGO that says the main problem here is landlordism is not going to get very far in its work. So I think what we need to do is apply a bit of class analysis to the development agencies and the interventions that go on, because in effect, they become adjuncts to the status quo. And following your assessment of whether NGOs actually do anything worthwhile, I've never ever seen an NGO that issued a report that said its project did not work, and its project could not work because power systems made it extremely difficult to implement something which benefited the rural poor. I work at Institute of Development Studies, and I teach at there and quite a few other universities. Not a single one of my students in recent years has any understanding of land tenure, or the concept of landlessness, or smallholding farmers. And the assumption is that an NGO will just go in and plug in a project which will somehow or other magically benefit the poor without understanding what is the causes of poverty. So to my mind, the whole problem of development interventions now is that they lack understanding of what are the causes of the poverty and vulnerability that they claim to be trying to influence. And in effect, we need to apply class analysis to these development interventions, because they have become adjuncts to the system of power that runs the country.
Well, thank you very much, Terry, for those comments. I largely endorse what you say. I will just point out that class analysis needs to be moderated to take account of complexities of ethnicity and religion, which tend to kind of refract the way class operates in these contexts. For example, in the Chittagong Hill Tracts case that I mentioned, it's difficult to simply treat it as a problem created by class relations. There are also ethnic and religious hierarchies at work, and the exploitation and the repression has that form. Nonetheless, interestingly, we now see that in the hill tracts, land grabbing is being done not only by Bengalis from outside, but also the more privileged amongst the hill peoples, the headmen and the karbaris. So you can also, I mean, what you are saying is validated, but it has to be kind of identified, traced through the intervening complexities of ethnicity and religion to show that once things begin to settle down, class relations begin to move to the forefront, even amongst, say, groups like the hill peoples. On sort of the NGO theories of intervention, what you mentioned, that the presumption that if you just send in an NGO with inputs and plug it in, outputs will come out, and there is this black box which somehow operates to transform inputs into outputs. I agree with that, and it would be good to have more soul searching and introspection and attempts to to critique, self-critiques and analysis on the part of NGO activists, because otherwise it's going to be very hard to make NGO intervention more effective rather than becoming co-opted into the existing status quo.
We have a question on chat. Are you able to read, Shapan? It's from Hannah Ahmed.
Hannah, let me, hang on. I'm trying to see. Oh, Hannah, yes. Hannah, you're here. Why don't you speak?
Hannah, would you like to speak? Because it'd be more easier to understand.
Yes, sure. Why not? No, thank you for the presentation, Shapan bhai. It was very, very good and very thorough. But I was thinking about I'll just read out the question actually. So I was wondering how you conceptualize the recent attacks on the Hindu community in Kumilla. We've seen that most of these attacks takes place in rural areas in Bangladesh. Another example being the Ramu Attack a few years ago. And they take place in the presence of their neighbors and their communities. So all the things that you talked about, globalization, migration, and everything that has changed the rural communities in the past few decades. So do you think that these kinds of changes have had an effect on how these communal attacks take place, or what do you think is going on?
Well, that's a huge question, and also a very complex one. Let me begin with the Ramu Attack, which you mentioned. For those of you who are not familiar with it, in September 2012, in the small town of Ramu in Cox's Bazar, temples were destroyed, not just one, but one after another, hour by hour, a carnage which spread beyond Ramu to Ukhia and neighboring cities. Now, what was behind this? There was no explicit religious conflict in that region as such. So it was precipitated by other factors. Now, the theories which have been most popular have tried to explain it by land grabs, that there were commercial groups which were interested in getting hold of this land, and not just commercial groups, but powerful agencies of the state for that matter, which needed land for their own establishments, who did this. And then up to a point, there is this is a very convincing kind of area, because Ramu is the only area where land establishments can increase, because the western coast from Cox's Bazar to Teknaf has already been taken over by various commercial establishments. So the only area where land expansion into new land could take place would be the Ramu area. So that certainly is very convincing. However, one thing about the Ramu incident was, even though the Buddhists, who are minorities in Bangladesh, protested, well, tried to get help from the administration and the police, they did not get any help until the damage was over. So the police did arrive, but after the burning of the temples had taken place. And this was systematic. And what is also very striking is that the police station, the various security forces, the BGB, the armed military, all were within 15 to 30 minutes distance. They could have arrived there. And it is a mystery as to why something like this could go on, not only for hours, but days together. 36 hours in my own research evaluation, without them intervening to stop it. Now, that suggests that the inaction, you have also to explain the inaction. In order to explain the destruction of minority temples, you have to also explain the inaction of the administration, including the security forces. So my hypothesis was that one has to look for a motive at that level. Now, in the case of Ramu, it could be related to the Rohingya conflict and the attacks on Muslims in Arakan and destruction of their temples. So this could be seen as a kind of tit for tat, or a preventive, or a measure of some kind to send a signal. In the case of the Kumilla and the other instances that you mentioned just now, we see some similarities. The fact that the police weren't there, nobody came to rescue, the administration did not intervene until after the event, is very similar. And it suggests, in that sense, we need to explain not only the people who might have been mobilized or even paid to do the damage, but we need to understand who employed them, who got them involved. Unlike the Ramu case, it's difficult to give us explanation of the destruction of temples in Kumilla, in Rangpur, Noakhali, and other places. So it has actually happened, I think, in no less than 20 to 30 places. And so it's much more difficult to give a unified explanation. But if there is an explanation, it has to be at the level of the state and the level of the government. That's all one can say.
There is a comment from Nahid Aslam. Are you able to read, or should I read it?
I can read I can see Nahid Aslam here. Why don't you speak? Because you might be able to elaborate. This is a very cryptic comment. It's not, if you could just.
Sorry, I joined late, but I mean, I'm just commenting on what you've been saying, Adnanji. I'm very skeptical of the whole NGO sector, and we're living in a very a society, in a world that is where greed is right. Greed is, and if you're weak, then those in power will just walk all over you. Ride roughshod over you. But I'm just very pessimistic about the human condition. And now we've got COP26 happening in Glasgow next month, and climate change and destruction of indigenous communities go hand in hand. And Bangladesh is very much at the forefront of the disasters that are happening due to climate change. But I feel that nothing much will happen, and COP26 will just be another talking shop for the world, the governments of the world. But I apologize for coming in late, and you've probably mentioned all this already.
No, I hadn't actually. Thank you for bringing and introducing those angles to it. In one talk about it's not possible to bring bring in all of these factors. And I can understand your skepticism of both NGO activities and of climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. I was just going to say that in addition to what you call new colonial capitalism, what we also see at work here is neoliberalism, particularly from the mid-1980s onwards. This is what has led to grabbing of lands in different parts of rural Bangladesh. For example, in the Noakhali Chor areas, it has been, land has been given to richer groups and commercial enterprises for shrimp cultivation, for export production and earning foreign exchange, even though very little shrimp production actually takes place. And much of the land that is given by the state isn't really owned by the state and is in fact inhabited by poor and landless peasants who have either occupancy rights and in some cases even legal titles. So you have a kind of policy orientation on the part of the state driven by forces of capitalism on a world scale, which has led to that kind of policy making. You see that also in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, where before and after the peace accord, Asian Development Bank and many other financing agencies have been pushing rubber plantations, again, with the same kind of interest. And the expansion of rubber plantations means eviction of the indigenous peoples and takeover of their private and common lands. So we, this pattern could be repeated across the country in different instances. You say greed, and I agree. It is greed, but it is greed which is systematic. I mean, it is a system based on making profit will mechanically and mindlessly lead to this kind of outcome. If you think of the pension funds and the huge investment funds that are being invested in poor countries to exploit their forests or their natural resources or their mines or their raw materials, what is driving it? Well, the managers of these funds are paid and hired and fired on the basis of whether they can give adequate profit to their shareholders. That is the primary concern, not the environment, not human rights. None of the other factors come into work. So you have this gigantic machine on a world scale operating to invest funds, trillions of dollars of funds.
Yeah.
And this is the inevitable outcome. You can say that it is individual greed, but it's more than greed. I mean, it's a systematic perversion of what economic activities should be aimed at.
I'm just going to say, and the sad thing is that there are so many of us from the Indian subcontinent living here in the West, and we are following the Western model. We are equally as, bad as everything from the developing world. All the resources are coming to the West, and we are benefiting from them without thought that these are products coming from the exploitation of our own people of origin and from our own countries of origin. But because we're sitting here in Britain, we forget that we are also the culprit.
I just want to defend NGOs for a second. Right now, I have worked in NGOs. I mean, the British NGOs, not Bangladeshi NGOs. But my family was involved in running an orphanage in Bangladesh, which my grandfather established, in the 1930s. And I grew up and seeing, the poor children, right? Fatherless, families bringing children, and what orphanage and the care meant for them. And our own orphanage is to get supplies, from European and American and other countries. But what I understand I know people sometimes go in an NGO, and you have big NGOs, they have vision and they exaggerate or they delude themselves, what they can achieve. But what I've learned is that there is a contribution, but NGO also very limited. What I understand is that you have the state and the private sector, and NGO develops to try and fill the gaps that results from the state and the private sector cannot reach. So they play an intermediary kind of role, from my experience. And I have also tried to develop. I worked in a lot of British inner city areas with a lot of poor and helpless people. Things have changed now in the 90s and 80s, because of globalization and deindustrialization, and there were really areas with a lot of poverty and a lot of unskilled people and a lot of problems. And one way we sought to help change, in addition to others, is to develop self-help groups so that they can help themselves. They learn the skills and discipline, of organizing, taking minutes, and how to, understand their own problems and then define and then engage with others, to argue their case, and so on. So I think NGOs, obviously, there will be, some fat cats, but if some NGOs run big organization, then they need to be paid well as well. Otherwise, how are you going to attract people with skills, and experience to manage, large programs? Anyway, so that's my sort of defense of some NGO activities.
I think part of the problem, Amitullah, is that NGO is a very broad term, and it can, under that classification, you have very, very different animals. The kind of NGOs that you were talking about in Britain, I can also think of NGOs who look after the homeless, the people sleeping on the streets. And you can think of the NGOs like the Ganashastu Kendra in Bangladesh, providing treatment to the poor. They are a very different kind of organization compared to others. And the others so the others are not the entire NGO group, but a subset of them. And these are the NGOs for which a verb has been invented in the English language called NGOization. And that really is about creating NGOs which, in some sense, perform corporate functions without being corporations. They're apparently non-profit organizations. But for example, if you look at the NGOs involved in the execution of climate change mitigation and adaptation projects, the carbon sink programs, the RED Plus programs, the Convention of Biodiversity, you'll see that there are these very professional and almost commercial organizations which are making huge amounts of money in the name of protecting the environment and in some sense mitigating or adapting to climate change. I don't have time to go into discussion of those, and some of them are also involved in very large scale grabbing of land or natural resources like the green grabs and so on. So we are talking about a very heterogeneous field, and I think it's useful to differentiate between different kinds of NGOs, those that are involved in this kind of quasi corporate activities, including land grabbing and profiteering, and those like the ones that you mentioned, which are devoid of such interest and working for human welfare, and many in between those two, the kind of spectrum in between.
I think Terry wants to ask another question. Terry, yeah.
It's related back to yours, Ahmadullah. I think Shapan has given a very good response to it, that it's actually about doing a class analysis of the different NGOs. What are they for and how do they aim to work? The NGOization of development and disaster risk and now climate change is, to my mind, a disaster, because they are corporations. They're corporatizing. It isn't just NGOizing, it's corporatizing the development field. I have never ever seen any NGO which is willing for people to go back 5 years or 10 years after they've finished a project for somebody to do an evaluation of whether anything still exists of what they did. And I'm trying to start up my own organization of volunteers, which will go to NGO project sites after they finished 10 years ago to see if there's any sign that they ever existed. And my hypothesis is that it's probably very likely that very few of them can be seen on the ground. They have very little legacy. So the ones that you're talking about are very different kinds of NGOs. I was very specific to talk about development, disaster, and climate change related to NGOs. Now, the amount of money that is going to be argued about next week in the COP of transfers from rich to poor countries is supposedly $100 billion a year, which is nothing. I mean, hardly any of it is going anyway, and I doubt whether very much will go anyway. But Britain spent 37 billion pounds on an almost completely useless COVID track and trace from one country's government on something which did not work. 37 billion against 100 billion, which is supposed to be what helps the entire developing world deal with climate change. So these are the kind of things that we need to be looking at.
There is a, Halima, would you like to read out? It'd be better if you read out your comment. Okay, I will read out. Halima says, in the light of your comment, Nahid, Mr. Nahid, what can Asians living in the West do to start understanding and implementing not to be part of abuse of our own people back in Bangladesh? The food we buy here, can we start asking how it's grown and if it's organic? Land growing shrimps, I understand, destroys the land. Can anybody say anything on that, Shapan?
Well, I mean, Halima has posed a kind of existential question about, what kind of things that you can do if you are living in the West, but your national origin is back in a third world country like Bangladesh. Obviously, you are concerned about what is happening there. And to some extent, what you've suggested is one way of pressurizing things which go wrong. Which used to consume shrimps, which are grown under extremely extortionate conditions. You can put pressure on high street retailers who are selling apparel produced in garments factories in Bangladesh, where the workers not even paid minimal wage rates, but huge profits are made by the intermediaries, the sellers and the retail sellers, and also the wholesalers who get it here. That's one way of protesting, but if you want to do more, you could, but that would involve you to know at first hand how these systems work. And you could, for example, go back to the places that you're concerned. Go and have a look at them. Spend a month perhaps just looking at the villages and the towns and the factories at first hand, writing this up, informing the community, informing decision makers, both in Britain and or wherever you're staying, and also in Bangladesh. Those are small things that one can do as individuals. It's nothing as effective as grand revolutions, but I mean, we can only do so much as individuals, and you can do your bit by doing the kind of pickups I guess.
Shapan, can I just say that the point that you made about going back and spending a month in your country of origin, that actually helped me. I mean, I went back and spent 6 months in this is about 20, 25 years ago. And it changed my whole way of looking at things. And I became less of a consumerist because I saw poverty as it really was. But I made a conscious effort not to just go and visit my relatives. You know, I went and spent time with people in the slums, and I visited around places and got to see the real. I'm actually from Pakistan, so I went to Punjab, and I spent 6 months there, but I feel that a lot of our youngsters born and brought up in Britain, they only go and visit their home country, spend a month there visiting their relatives and having a very bad experience, because usually it's all sort of family politics and then you just get pissed, you get put off by it all, you don't want to go back. But if you actually go and see the real country, you know, and the issues, because I went and I did some voluntary work in a local school. I taught English. I spoke to people that my parents would say, what do you want to do that for? You know, but I wanted to see the real Pakistan.
Sure.
And I think there needs to be a desire created in the children today. I'm surprised that so many Bangladeshis living in Tower Hamlets have never been to Bangladesh. You know, I mean, that girl that went to Syria, what was her name? I've forgotten her name now. Yeah, right. She was willing to go to Syria. She'd never been to Bangladesh. She didn't know anything about it. Yet to look at her, she looked Bangladeshi with her headscarf and everything dressed. I bet she ate fish and curry, fish and rice at home. Probably spoke Bengali or Sylheti with her family. Yet she said she was British, but she had never been to Bangladesh. And she's typical of the younger generation, not just of Bangladesh, but Pakistan and India as well.
Yes.
Yeah. But we need to encourage youngsters to go and spend time in other places, not just think, oh, I want to go to America or I want to go to Australia because all the Europeans want to do that. But go back to your, the Americans come to Britain because they have links to Britain. This is their origin. This is their original homeland. Why do we feel ashamed about going back to our origins? And why do we feel ashamed to call ourselves Indian? We are ethnic Indians. It was the British that made us into Pakistani and Bangladeshi. We are Indian, and we should be proud of the fact that we are ethnic Indians, and we have an affinity. I'm not talking about India, the political India as it is today. I'm talking about India pre-1947. You know, and we should have an affinity to that because that is our motherland. But the children of today living in Britain or living in the West know nothing about their motherland. And they have no affinity, no love for that. Yet the Americans have love for Britain.
I think you will find
the Australians have love for Britain. The New Zealanders have love for Britain. The Canadians have love for Britain. Why? Because Britain is their motherland.
I think you will find, plane before the pandemic, all the planes going to Bangladesh, whether Bangladesh Biman or through, Gulf and those Arab Airlines, they're all full of Bangladeshis going back home. And, there has been more and more families taking their children. I mean, there are in Tarhamlis go about 85,000 or 90,000 Bangladeshis, and also not everybody can afford to take the whole family. It's quite expensive. But from my experience, more and more young people are taking an interest, and parents do try to instill love and pride in the culture and origin in difficult circumstances. I think there's something from Mariam Ahmed. I think she said that, Nahida, I think the older generation, their experience with colonialism and idealism of the West were things which put off the younger generation to go back home. Nahid, do you agree with that?
Maybe, I don't know. I certainly, what children learned at school about Africa and Asia put people off. They didn't, these are basket cases, it was racism, and we got sucked into that racism. We didn't value ourselves. We don't feel empowered. You can only feel good about yourself if you feel good about where you came from. And we were taught that being Pakistani, or if you were Asian, you were a Paki, and being a Paki is something bad.
I think this is probably a bit out of date, because young people I meet are on Facebook, they're all sharing images of Bangladesh, and sharing their experience and their love.
That's good then, that's good. Maybe I am a bit out of date, but I was born, I'm 54 years old now, and hopefully the world is becoming a better place, but I'm just a very skeptical person.
I think we'll finish soon. Would you like to say anything, Shapan, before we finish?
Yes, just parting words. I'd like to thank all of you who attended, and thanks particularly those who have asked questions: Terry Cannon, Peter Musgrave, Nahid Islam, and a few others, Maria Ahmed, Hannah. Also thanks to my friends Bruce Curry and Hannah Ahmed, who were present, and Bablu. I don't know where Bablu has gone. Bablu is working on his PhD with me. So it's good to see you all. And feel free to get in touch with me. I'd be interested to know more about some of your work. Nahid, thanks for giving your experience from Pakistan. That resonates with the experience of many others in Pakistan and also Bangladesh and elsewhere. And Terry Cannon, I don't know if you were at IDS Sussex, but I'd be interested to know more about your work. And also Peter Musgrave on your comments. So yes, I'll conclude with that by thanking everyone and suggesting that we can continue to interact if there is interest.
Just before I end, Halima say something on chat. This is kind of, goes against what I was saying. She said that a few years ago, she was advised to go to the EU or USA because Bangladesh was not safe to travel. I agree with that as well, right? Relatively speaking, Bangladesh is not very safe. I've been to many other countries, where I can travel around on my own with 2 cameras late at night. But Bangladesh, I need an escort, right? Even to go short distance. So that's true as well, right? Yeah? Even then, I found that increasing number of younger people. I don't mean children. But when it's university or teen age and in their 20s, there is an increased kind of hunger, to connect with the motherland, go there and see what's happening. Anyway, thank you everybody for joining and participating in the discussion. Tomorrow we have got another session of Bengal History Week. This is extended to the whole of month. I hope you can all join tomorrow. Tomorrow's one is it's by Dr. Navanipa Bhattacharya. She's based in Delhi. I think her original home was Eastern Bengal. Her family moved to Assam, the other side after partition. So she will talk about, growing up in Northeast India, right? As a Bengali or Sylheti, but she will also talk about the history of the region, going back quite a bit. So I think this is really an important topic. We have had good response. So I hope you all here can join as well. And so thank you very much. And I will put this on YouTube soon.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you, and hope to see you tomorrow.
Yeah, goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Shapan.
everybody.
Shapan.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Hangan, before you go quickly, hello, if you're still here, message from Mariam Ahmed. She said, as a Bengali woman, I was never allowed to travel anywhere at all, not even my father's village. It's a shame. Then someone said, maybe Muhammad, would you organize a holiday group to Bangladesh? we can think about it, right? Yeah. If you want to help us, with Brother Shapan's connection and so on, I'm sure we might be able to do something about it. Okay, thank you. See you.
There used to be times when you could, the embassies would help to take people to Pakistan. This was about 20 years ago. I know, maybe longer than that, but so I'm sure the embassies could help.
Yeah. I think it's better not to get involved with the political structures, right?
Yeah, but they have the money. They have the money.
Well, Okay, yes, I'll see you tomorrow. Those who are coming.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.